Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here, so glad you've joined me again. Tell me, what's your favourite warm drink to enjoy while listening to these mysteries? Tea, cocoa, or perhaps a cosy cup of coffee? I love hearing about the small comforts that make your evening special. And of course, do subscribe if you haven't already. Now, get comfortable. The mystery awaits. Chapter 1. The Woman at the Edge of the Village. The village of Loch Dubh had a long memory and a short tolerance for outsiders who did not earn their place within it. This was not cruelty. It was simply the way of things in the northwest Highlands of Scotland, where the mountains came down to the loch's edge as though asserting a prior claim to the land, and where the mist rolled in off the water on autumn mornings with the slow, proprietary air of something that has always lived there and always will. It was into this ancient and particular world that Morag Sinclair had arrived, a little over a year ago on a Tuesday in late September, driving a small and sensible blue hatchback that was not new but had been well cared for. She had taken the lease on the empty shop at the far end of the main street, the one that had stood vacant since Archie Doig's fishing tackle business quietly failed, and within a fortnight she had filled its windows with handmade soaps wrapped in brown paper, skeins of wool in heathery colours, and small jars of lip balm and hand cream arranged on a piece of driftwood. A hand-lettered sign above the door read, "Heather and Stone, Handcraft Goods." It was the sort of shop that Loch Dubh did not strictly need, but secretly found it could not resist. Constable Hamish Macbeth had watched its opening with the mild and unhurried interest he brought to most things. He had been standing outside the Tommel Castle Hotel with Lugs, his large and philosophically inclined dog, when Morag Sinclair carried her first display boxes through the door. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back plainly from a face that was pleasant without being remarkable. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to take up no more space than absolutely necessary. Hamish had raised a hand in greeting, and she'd smiled back, a polite and practised smile. "New shop," he said, with the Highland gift for stating the obvious in a tone that invites conversation. "New shop," she agreed, and went back inside. Lugs had watched her go with his customary expression of mild approval, which Hamish had long since decided was no reliable guide to character. In the weeks that followed, Morag Sinclair went about the business of inserting herself into village life with a quiet skill that Hamish, had he been in the habit of admiring such things openly, might have called impressive. She brought soup to Geordie Mackay when he had his chest, even though she'd met him no more than twice. She donated a not inconsiderable sum toward the repair of the Kirk's leaking vestry roof when the collection plate came around, and she did so without making a point of it, which was the surest way to have Mrs. Wellington notice. She did not gossip, which in Loch Dubh was itself a kind of social distinction, rather like abstaining from drink in a village where abstaining from drink was considered mildly eccentric, but ultimately respectable. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, who was the closest thing Loch Dubh had to an official arbiter of newcomers, had pronounced after about 4 months that Morag Sinclair was, on the whole, perfectly all right. Coming from Mrs. Wellington, this was roughly equivalent to a papal endorsement. "She is a quiet body," Mrs. Wellington informed Hamish one morning, having cornered him outside the post office with the purposeful air of one who has information to impart and the time to impart it at length. "Not flashy, doesn't wear unsuitable shoes or talk about property prices. She came to the harvest social and helped with the teas without being asked. I consider that very telling." "Aye," said Hamish. Lugg sat beside him and yawned. "One does wonder," Mrs. Wellington added, in the careful tone that indicated she had been wondering for some time, "where exactly she's from. She's not said precisely. She mentions Edinburgh, and then she mentions Perth, and somehow the two never quite connect into a coherent personal history." Hamish, whose instincts for human nature had been sharpened by years of policing a small community where everything was everyone's business, had noticed this too, though he had not said so. There was a practised quality to Morag Sinclair's warmth. She was kind in a way that felt less spontaneous than carefully considered, as though she had arrived in Loch Dubh carrying a list of things a good neighbour does, and had set about completing it with quiet determination. This was not in itself suspicious. People reinvented themselves for all manner of reasons that were entirely their own affair. The Highlands had long served as a place of reinvention. The mountains did not ask where you came from. The loch did not check references. A person could arrive at the edge of the world and simply begin again, if they were willing to carry peat and endure the midges and show up for the harvest social. Still, Hamish watched. He watched her in the way that he watched most things in Lochdew, with the unhurried attention of a man who had no ambition to be elsewhere, and therefore found the present moment more than sufficiently interesting. He had been offered promotions, he had declined them. The police superintendent in Strathbane, a man called Blair who had the complexion of undercooked pastry, and the disposition to match, considered Hamish Macbeth a waste of a detective. Hamish Macbeth considered being considered a waste of a detective a perfectly tolerable state of affairs. What he had here, in this long, rainy finger of coast tucked between the mountains and the sea, was exactly what he wanted. The village, the loch, the cat, Sonsy, large and wild-eyed, who came and went as she pleased. Lugs, who did the same but with greater emotional investment in Hamish's company. The long evenings with a dram by the stove, the knowledge that if anything happened, really happened, he would hear about it within the hour. On a Friday evening in October, as the loch lay flat and silver under a sky the colour of old pewter, Hamish stopped outside Heather and Stone to look at the new display Morag had put in the window. There were small wooden bowls now, alongside the soaps, and a series of framed prints of Highland plants rendered in delicate ink. Morag appeared in the doorway as though she had been expecting him, which she may well have been, since Hamish was a man of considerable predictability in his movements. "Grand window," he said. "Thank you, Constable." She leaned against the doorframe with her arms folded. In the pale evening light, something in her expression was harder to read than usual. Not unfriendly, but watchful. "Are you settling in all right?" he asked. "The winters up here can be a bit of a shock if you're not used to them." "I don't mind the cold," she said. "Aye, well," he paused. Luggs had pressed his nose against the bottom of the shop door and was sniffing with professional thoroughness. "If you ever need anything, you know where the station is." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the distinct impression that she was weighing him, assessing something about him that she found either reassuring or concerning. He could not be sure which. "I do," she said. "Thank you, Constable Macbeth." He walked on along the loch shore with Luggs padding beside him, the water dark and still on his left and the mountains rising against the sky ahead, and he thought, as he often did when something was not quite sitting right, that there was a woman who had learned how to belong to a place without ever quite letting the place belong to her. It was a small thought. He filed it away in the part of his mind where small thoughts waited, patient and unhurried, for company. Within the week, the company arrived. Chapter 2. A Visitor and a Death. He came on a Wednesday, which was in itself mildly suspicious, since most people with legitimate business in Lochdoub arrived on a Monday or a Friday, as the bus from Strathbane ran on Mondays and Fridays, and there was really no other sensible way to reach the village unless you had a car or a bicycle, or an unusual commitment to walking on single-track roads in November. This man had a car. It was a dark grey saloon, 4 years old, hire company clean, with an Inverness number plate and a rental sticker in the rear window that caught the light as he pulled up on the main street and stepped out with the unhurried confidence of someone who has rehearsed his arrival in advance. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of unremarkable face that is difficult to describe afterwards, the sort that witnesses always struggle with. Average height, average build, a jaw that was neither strong nor weak. He wore a waxed jacket that was slightly too new for the Highlands, and carried a small overnight bag with the ease of a man who lived out of them. Hamish, who happened to be walking Luggs along the harbour wall at the time, took all of this in over the space of approximately 4 seconds and decided, with the casual certainty of long practice, that this was a man who was very deliberately not drawing attention to himself. In Hamish's experience, few things drew attention more effectively. The man's name, as he gave it cheerfully to Rory at the Lochdoub Hotel, was Alistair Grant. He said he was up from Inverness for a few days, interested in the fishing, thinking of writing a small piece about the area for a travel magazine. He asked for a room, was given one, paid cash in advance, and carried his own bag upstairs without waiting to be shown. Rory, whose relationship with guests was purely commercial, and whose curiosity about them was essentially nil, thought nothing of it. The information reached Hamish anyway, by the usual and impeccably efficient channels of village communication, before Grant had finished unpacking. It was Donny Mackenzie who brought it, ostensibly to report that someone had left a gate open on the south pasture, but actually because Donny had been walking past the hotel and had seen the dark grey car, and because in Lochdoub a dark grey hire car was an event of sufficient magnitude to warrant reporting to the constable. "Cash," Hamish repeated thoughtfully. That's what Rory said, Donnie confirmed, with the satisfaction of a man who has correctly anticipated that this detail would be of interest. Grant appeared in the village the following morning with the studied leisure of a man on holiday. He walked along the loch shore. He photographed the mountains with his phone. He sat in the Claymore bar for an hour and a half and nursed a whisky and talked about the weather with Archie McLean, who could talk about the weather for considerably longer than an hour and a half and never once feel he had exhausted the subject. At 11:30 on Thursday morning, Alistair Grant walked into Heather and Stone. Hamish was across the street when it happened, allegedly examining a crack in the pavement outside the post office that someone had complained about, and actually watching the village with the attentiveness of a man who believes that cracks in pavements are rarely the most interesting thing happening in his immediate vicinity. He saw Grant pause at the window of Morag's shop. He saw the man look in, take a small breath that was just visible from across the street, and then push open the door with the particular firmness of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through. Hamish waited. 2 women came in and out of the shop in the next 20 minutes. Grant did not. When he emerged at last, he was smiling, and the smile was the kind that does not reach the eyes because the eyes are doing something else entirely. He looked up and down the street, registered Hamish across the way with a nod that was perfectly friendly and perfectly blank, and walked back toward the hotel. Hamish crossed the street and went into the shop. Morag was behind the counter arranging a display of beeswax candles. Her movements were composed and unhurried, but her face, when she looked up, had the careful blankness of someone who has just spent 20 minutes arranging it. "Afternoon," said Hamish. "Constable." She placed a candle with precision. "I see you had a visitor." "A customer." Another candle. "He was interested in the soaps. Bought 2 bars of the pine tar. Very polite." "Did you know him?" The pause before she answered was not long, perhaps half a second. But Hamish had spent many years interviewing people in small rooms, and half a second can be an enormous distance. "No," she said. "Should I have?" "He said his name was Alistair Grant. He's staying at the hotel." "I'm sure he is," said Morag, and her tone closed around the subject like a hand closing around something small that must not be allowed to escape. Hamish bought a bar of soap, pine tar as it happened, though not by design, and went home to think. That evening the sky over Lochdew turned the deep bruised purple that presages a serious Highland night, and the temperature dropped with the sudden decisiveness of a trapdoor. Hamish ate his supper at the kitchen table with lugs under his feet, and Sonsey occupying the chair across from him with the imperious indifference of a cat who considers chairs to be hers by natural right. He thought about Alistair Grant. He thought about Morag Sinclair's half-second pause. He thought about cash paid in advance and a jacket that had never seen proper rain. He was still thinking when, at 11:20, the church bell rang. One clear, deep note rolling out over the dark village and the darker loch, moving away into the mountains until the silence reclaimed it. Hamish lifted his head. The bell rang a second time. He was pulling on his jacket before the second note had finished sounding, because the church bell in Lochdew rang on Sundays, and at funerals and at the New Year, and it did not ring twice at 11:20 on a Thursday night in November for any reason that was the business of no one. Luggs followed him to the door with the resigned air of a dog who has learned that when the jacket comes off the hook at unusual hours, the evening is unlikely to improve. The village was dark and still. A single light burned in the upstairs window of the Tommel Castle Hotel, half a mile along the Loch Road, and the harbour lamps laid yellow stripes across the black water. Hamish walked quickly toward the kirk, his breath clouding in the cold air, the gravel of the path loud under his boots. The churchyard gate stood open. He found Alistair Grant 20 feet inside it, at the base of the old boundary wall where the stones were oldest and roughest, and where, in summer, the wildflowers grew through the gaps. The man was lying on his back with his arms at his sides in the posture of someone who has lain down to sleep in a very inconvenient location. The right side of his head had met the base of the wall with considerable force. Hamish crouched beside him and confirmed what he already knew. Then he stood up, took his phone from his pocket and called Strathbane, looking out over the churchyard at the dark shapes of the old stones and the black outline of the mountains beyond. Somewhere in the village a light came on. Then another. Lochdew was waking up, the way it always did when something happened, all at once and with the unerring instinct of a community in which news travels faster than sound. Hamish Macbeth stood over the body of Alistair Grant and thought about a woman who had claimed not to know the man, and a pause that had lasted half a second, and 2 bars of pine tar soap, and the fact that the church bell, by long-established tradition and the physical arrangement of the bell tower, could not ring itself. It had been rung. Someone had rung it twice. The question that settled in Hamish's mind and refused with a certain mulish Highland persistence to shift was not why the bell had been rung, but for whom. Chapter 3. The Background That Doesn't Fit. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived from Strathbane at 7:30 the following morning in a mood that could fairly be described as volcanic, and which had been worsened considerably by the single-track road, by the November mist, by the fact that his driver had twice been forced to reverse into passing places to allow lorries through, and by the general circumstance of being summoned at dawn to a village that Blair had long considered to be a blight upon the operational map of Highland policing. Macbeth, he said, climbing out of the police car and taking in the churchyard with the expression of a man confronted by an affront to his personal comfort. "What in God's name have you got yourself into this time?" "A dead man," said Hamish pleasantly. "Alistair Grant, or so he said he was. Found him at 11:20 last night. Head struck against the lower boundary wall. No weapon recovered, so it's either a fall or it was the wall itself that did the damage. Or he was hit with something, and the something was taken away," Blair said, in the tone of a man demonstrating intellectual superiority to an inferior. "Aye, that too," agreed Hamish, who had been thinking exactly this since before Blair had left Strathbane. The police surgeon from Strathbane declared life extinct, as police surgeons do when life is already extremely extinct and has been for some hours, and the forensic team arrived and put up their tape and moved about the churchyard with the purposeful air of people performing a ritual that will produce in due course a report. Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, who was Blair's junior and Hamish's friend, arrived slightly behind the others and found Hamish standing by the gate. "The great man's in a state," Jimmy murmured, accepting the flask of tea that Hamish produced from his jacket pocket, with the practised ease of a constable who has learned that dawn crime scenes and hot beverages are inseparable companions. "He's always in a state," said Hamish. "It's his natural condition." "Any ideas?" "Several," said Hamish. "None that I'm ready to share just yet." Jimmy gave him the look that indicated this was entirely expected, and walked away to take statements, and Blair descended upon Hamish for a second time to inform him that he was to keep his considerable nose out of the investigation and confine himself to being useful in a local capacity, which in Blair's lexicon meant answering questions about roads, providing the names of people who might have seen things, and thereafter standing quietly in corners until summoned. Hamish agreed with every appearance of compliance and went back to the station to run a background check on Morag Sinclair. He did this quietly, at his kitchen table, with a mug of tea at his elbow and lugs asleep on his feet. Sonsy had departed at first light on some private errand and had not returned, which was perfectly normal and not a thing that concerned Hamish, though he noted it in the way that he noted most things, reflexively and without particular emphasis. The results took the better part of the morning to assemble, and when they were assembled they had the quality of a jigsaw puzzle in which several of the pieces clearly belonged to a different box entirely. Morag Ann Sinclair, born 14th of March, he found a birth record of that approximate date, and that approximate name in the General Register for Scotland. But the details were thin in a way that might indicate incomplete data entry, and might indicate something else. The address she had given when she signed her lease was traceable to a flat in Perth that had been occupied by a different woman, a Mrs. Jean Hardy, 63, retired, and apparently rather surprised to learn her former address was still in circulation, until 4 years ago. The employment history was more troubling. There were references, online traces, the digital detritus that people leave behind them in the modern world without thinking, a mention in a craft fair program, a brief profile on a now-dormant social media account. But these references, when placed alongside one another in chronological order, created an impossibility. Morag Sinclair had apparently worked at a craft cooperative in Pitlochry, while simultaneously being listed as a participant in a weaving workshop series in Dumfries. The dates overlapped by 6 months. A person can be in 2 places at once in the administrative record only when the record is being assembled from scratch, drawing on existing fragments and hoping that no one looks closely enough to notice the joins. And then there was the address in Dunblane, a property associated with the name Morag Sinclair and a slightly different date of birth, 2 years younger, had been listed in a council tax record before being quietly removed. The woman associated with that property had died in a car accident outside Stirling 3 years ago. Her name had been Morag Ann Sinclair, and she'd been 38 years old, and her death had been registered, and her affairs wound up by a solicitor in Dunblane who, when Hamish made a discreet inquiry, confirmed that the deceased had no living relatives of note, and that the estate, modest as it was, had been settled without difficulty. 2 Morag Sinclairs, 1 dead, 1 running a craft shop in a Highland village and bringing soup to the sick. Hamish scratched Luggs behind the ears in a meditative fashion. Luggs submitted to this with the patience of one who has learned that sometimes the scratching is less about affection than about thinking, and that it is best to allow both processes to proceed without interruption. "Too tidy in places," Hamish said aloud to no one in particular, "and too empty in others." Luggs made a small sound that might have been agreement. Hamish had encountered borrowed identities before. They came in a variety of shapes. There were the obvious frauds, the benefit claimants, the people with creditors, the men who'd left one family and started another without the paperwork to support the transition. These were shabby, careless constructions, full of holes. And then there was the other kind, the kind that had been built with care, selected rather than fabricated, the assumption of a name that was real enough to pass scrutiny, but belonged to someone who would not be contradicting anyone. A dead woman's identity, carefully chosen, carefully maintained. That was not the work of someone cutting corners. That was the work of someone very frightened indeed. Hamish sat with this thought for a while, watching the loch through the kitchen window. The mist had partially lifted, and the mountains across the water were visible now in pale, wintry outline, their upper reaches still wrapped in cloud. A fishing boat moved slowly along the far shore, unhurried, purposeful, going about its ancient business. The question was not whether Morag Sinclair had assumed a false identity. The question was why, and whether the why had anything to do with the dead man in the churchyard. There was, he reflected, a considerable difference between a woman hiding from something and a woman who had done something worth hiding from. His instincts, and he had learned, over many years and several solved murders, to trust these instincts even when he could not explain them to Blair, told him that the former was more likely than the latter. Morag's year in Lochdew had been a year of careful, steady belonging. She had given more than she had taken. She had harmed no one. The dead man, on the other hand, had arrived with cash and a hire car and a 2 new jacket and a visit to her shop that had left her face arranged like a mask. None of this was evidence. Not a word of it would satisfy Blair, who required things to be concrete and preferably written down by someone else. But Hamish Macbeth had not solved the crimes he had solved by waiting for Blair to be satisfied. He closed his laptop, drained his tea, and spent a moment looking out at the loch and the mountains and the pale November sky, which was the colour of the inside of an oyster shell and just as cold. Then he put on his jacket, clipped Luggs onto his lead, and walked down the main street toward Heather and Stone, where the hand-lettered sign swung in the raw coastal wind, and a light burned in the back room behind the display of beeswax candles, warm and steady as a kept secret. Chapter 4. Plausible Truths. The shop bell above the door of Heather and Stone made a sound like a small startled bird when Hamish pushed it open, and Morag looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who had been expecting something, and had spent the interval since last night deciding what face to put on for it. She had chosen calm. It fitted her well. "Constable Macbeth," she said. "I heard about the man at the kirk. It's a terrible thing." "It is," Hamish agreed, releasing Luggs's lead and allowing the dog to conduct his customary survey of the shop's lower reaches. There were no other customers. The village, this particular Friday morning, had acquired the subdued and watchful quality it always took on when something serious had happened within it, as though Lochdew itself were holding its breath. "I was hoping you might give me a few minutes." "Of course." She gestured toward the wooden stool on the customer side of the counter, with the ease of a woman making a guest comfortable in her own home, and Hamish sat, and they looked at each other across a display of heather-scented candles with the mutual assessment of 2 people who are each pretending to less knowledge than they actually possess. "You told me yesterday you didn't know Alistair Grant," Hamish said. He said it without emphasis, the way you might state the colour of the sky. "That's right." "And yet he spent 20 minutes in your shop." "He was browsing. Some people take their time." She straightened a candle that did not require straightening. "He asked about the soaps. He was interested in how the pine tar was sourced. We had a perfectly ordinary conversation." "What else did you talk about?" "The weather," she said. "The village." He asked how long I'd been here, and I told him about a year, and he said the Highlands were beautiful in a way that suggested he found them inconvenient. That's all. It was a convincing account. It was detailed without being over-elaborate, natural without being too natural. Hamish had taken enough statements in enough rooms to recognise the difference between a person recalling something and a person reciting something, and this was hovering precisely on the border between the two. "Where are you from originally, Morag?" he asked, making the shift in subject as smooth and unremarkable as possible. If she registered the change of direction, she did not show it. "Edinburgh, mostly. My family moved around a fair amount when I was young. My father's work took him to different places." "What sort of work?" "Logistics, haulage, that kind of thing." A brief fond smile that could have meant anything. "He was on the road more often than not." "And your mother?" "She passed away when I was in my 20s. Cancer." The smile faded appropriately. "There's just me, really. No brothers or sisters. It's part of why I wanted to settle somewhere. Put down roots." Hamish nodded slowly as though absorbing this. Every sentence she offered was of the kind that could not easily be disproven. A father in logistics who moved around, a mother dead of a common illness, an only child with no ties. There was nothing in any of it that could be grabbed hold of and tested. It was like trying to catch water in a net. "You mentioned Perth the other day to Mrs. Wellington," he said, a tiny shift, barely perceptible. "Did I? I lived there for a time, after Edinburgh. It's where I started the craft work, took some courses, got the business going properly." "And before Lochdu, where were you most recently?" "A small place outside Crieff," she said, "renting a cottage. Very isolated, lovely views, but perhaps a bit too isolated in the end. That's what brought me north." She looked at him directly, and her eyes were clear and steady and entirely unreadable. "I wanted company, a community, somewhere I could be useful." Hamish looked down at Luggs, who had settled with his chin on the bottom shelf of a display unit, and was regarding a bar of soap with philosophical detachment. What struck him was not any single thing she had said, but the quality of the whole. A person describing their life from memory makes small corrections, loses a thread and retrieves it, contradicts themselves on minor details. Morag's account had none of these textures. It had the smoothness of something gone over many times in private, until all the rough edges were worn away. She never paused to search for a word. She never began a sentence and rerouted it. She answered what he asked and nothing more, which was in itself a kind of answer. And yet, she was not lying in the crude sense of the word. Hamish had met liars of every variety, from the brazen to the terrified, and what he felt in this room was neither of those things. What he felt, and he trusted the feeling even without being able to put a precise name to it, was someone telling truth that had been carefully selected. True things arranged to form a picture that was not the whole picture, a frame around an absence. "The man who died," he said, returning to it obliquely. "Grant, did he say anything to you that struck you as odd? Any reason he might have been at the kirkyard last night?" "No," she said. And this time the pause was not half a second, but a full one, and it was not the pause of calculation, but something rawer underneath it, something that pulled briefly at the controlled surface of her expression before she smoothed it back down. "He didn't say anything like that." Hamish stood up, and Luggs roused himself from communion with the soap display. "If you think of anything," Hamish said, which was what constables always said, and which always meant rather more than it appeared to, "you'll let me know." "Naturally," said Morag. Then unexpectedly, "Is it likely to cause a great deal of disruption? For the village, I mean, police coming and going?" "For a while," he said. He watched her face as he added, "Detective Chief Inspector Blair will want to speak to everyone. He's very thorough." This was not remotely true, but it served. Something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt, not the calculating flicker of someone assessing risk to themselves. It was more fundamental than that. It was the look of a person standing in an open field and hearing, some distance away, the sound of a thing that might or might not be thunder. Outside, the loch was slate grey, and the mountains were lost in low cloud, and the village moved about its diminished business with the quiet insistence of a community that has absorbed shocks before and will absorb them again. 3 women were speaking in lowered voices outside the post office. Hamish recognised the posture, not gossip but concern, which in Lochdu bore a different face. He walked slowly back toward the station with Luggs at his heel, and the raw November wind off the water finding the gaps in his jacket, and he turned the conversation over in his mind the way you turn a stone to see what lives beneath it. She was frightened, that much was certain. But the fear she carried was not the fear of someone caught out in a crime. It was older than that, and more specific, and it had been living with her long enough that she had learned to wear it quietly, like an old injury that flares in cold weather. Hamish had seen that kind of fear before, though rarely. It was the fear of a person who has escaped something once and knows, with the certainty of experience, that escape is never entirely permanent. What he could not yet determine was whether the thing she had escaped had now found its way to Lochdoub in the form of a dead man with an unremarkable face and 2 bars of pine tar soap in his overnight bag. He suspected, without yet being able to prove it, that the answer was yes. Behind him, as he turned the corner toward the station, he heard the sign above Heather and Stone creak and swing in the wind, and then the soft sound of the door being shut and the bolt drawn across, though it was not yet noon, and the shop's hand-lettered hours said it ought to have been open for 3 hours yet. Chapter 5. The Name That Wasn't Hers. The bus from Strathbane on Monday morning brought 3 things of note. A parcel for Archie MacLean that turned out to contain the wrong size of fishing reel, and that Archie would spend the better part of the week complaining about. A young man from somewhere south of Perth, who was writing a dissertation on crofting land tenure, and who made the tactical error of mentioning this to Angus MacLean, the self-styled seer, thereby ensuring that he would not be free of unsolicited opinions until well after dark. And a woman of approximately 65 who descended from the bus with a tartan holdall looked up the main street with the expression of someone consulting an internal map, and made her way to the Lochdoub Hotel on foot without asking directions. Her name, as she gave it to Rory at the front desk, was Mrs. Elspeth Kerr, and she said she was making her way up through the Highlands in a leisurely fashion, taking in the scenery, no fixed itinerary, just enjoying the autumn colours and the quiet. Rory gave her room 4, which had the better view of the loch, and she thanked him and carried her own bag up the stairs with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had never in her life waited to be helped with luggage, and did not intend to begin now. Hamish heard about her before she reached the first-floor landing, because Rory's receptionist was Katrina Bain, whose sister was married to Donny Mackenzie, and Donny Mackenzie had already demonstrated a highly developed sense of what constituted reportable events where the constable was concerned. Hamish noted the new arrival, filed her alongside the dissertation student and the wrong-sized fishing reel, and went about his day. It was Tuesday afternoon, the sky a hard, high blue entirely free of its recent cloud, the loch glittering with the particular brittle brightness of a Highland November that has temporarily abandoned its character, when Mrs. Elspeth Kerr walked into Heather and Stone. Hamish was not there to witness it. He was half a mile up the loch road returning a stray sheep to its field, a task which the sheep regarded as a personal affront and resisted with considerable spirit, and which occupied him for long enough that by the time he came back down the main street with his jacket in a condition that suggested the sheep had not conceded gracefully, the thing had already happened. He knew something had happened because Morag was standing outside her own shop, with her arms folded across her chest and her face showing something close to the expression he had last seen in Chapter 4. The open-field look, the far-off thunder, but sharpened now, compressed into something with more edges. And because Mrs. Elspeth Kerr was standing 6 feet away from her on the pavement, breathing rather quickly, with one hand pressed to her sternum in the manner of a woman managing a shock to her system. They were not speaking when Hamish arrived, which suggested they had been speaking and had stopped, and that what had passed between them had not been the cheerful exchange of strangers, discovering a shared enthusiasm for hand-poured soaps. "Ladies," said Hamish, which was not his finest conversational opening, but which served the purpose of announcing himself without making any premature assumptions. Mrs. Kerr turned to look at him with the relief of a person who has been hoping for a third party, and is gratified to get one. She was a solid, composed sort of woman, white-haired and sharp-featured, with the manner of a retired headmistress, or possibly a retired sheriff clerk, someone who had spent a professional lifetime taking down facts and not being distracted from them by emotional weather. "Are you the police?" she asked. "I am," said Hamish. "Constable Macbeth. Is everything all right?" "No," said Mrs. Kerr with the directness of someone who considers vagueness a form of dishonesty. "I don't believe it is." She glanced at Morag, then back at Hamish. "I have just seen someone I had not expected to see, and I am finding it somewhat surprising." Morag said nothing. She was looking at Mrs. Kerr with an expression that was not cold exactly, but had contracted, the way a sea anemone contracts when something touches it, all the soft, open parts drawn inward with smooth and practised speed. Perhaps we could go inside, Hamish suggested. They sat in the back room of heather and stone among boxes of stock, and the faint, sweet smell of beeswax and dried heather. Hamish on a crate, Mrs. Kerr on the only chair, and Morag standing near the door to the shop front with the particular positioning of someone who has not yet decided whether to stay. Luggs lay down in the centre of the floor and put his chin on his paws and waited, which was more than could be said for the humans around him. "I knew her," said Mrs. Kerr, nodding at Morag, "as Fiona Aldridge, about 8 years ago in Inverness. I worked at a solicitor's firm. As a legal secretary I was there for 23 years, and she came in several times in connection with some business that I understood to be related to a client of the firm." She paused, arranging her recollections with professional care. "She had the same face. The hair's different, and she's perhaps a little thinner, but the face is the same. I don't forget faces." "You're mistaken," Morag said. Her voice was very level. "I've never lived in Inverness. I don't know anyone by that name." "You were wearing a green wool coat," Mrs. Kerr said, not unkindly. "The second time you came in. There was a small burn mark on the right cuff here." She touched her own wrist. "You caught it on a candle, I think. You apologised for it, as if I'd had a personal stake in the coat. I remember thinking you were a very careful sort of person." The silence that followed had a particular weight. Hamish watched Morag's hands. They were clasped in front of her at her waist, and the fingers of her left hand had tightened on the fingers of her right until the knuckles showed white. "You're mistaken," Morag said again. But the repetition had lost the authority of the first attempt. It was maintaining a position rather than asserting a fact. Mrs. Kerr looked at Hamish. "I never thought I'd see her again," she said quietly. "After what happened afterward, I assumed she'd gone very far away." A pause. I'm glad she appears to be all right." There was something in the way she said it that caught Hamish's attention more sharply than anything else in the conversation. Not the words themselves, but the relief behind them, the particular relief of someone who has not been sure for some years whether a person was all right or was something considerably worse. "What happened?" Hamish asked. "After she came to the firm?" Mrs. Kerr folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm not sure how much I should say," she said carefully. "It was a client matter. There are questions of confidentiality, even now." "There is a dead man in the churchyard," Hamish said, not unkindly. Mrs. Kerr looked up. Something shifted in her expression, a reassessment, a recalibration of how much the situation might warrant. "It was a complicated business," she said. "Financial, mostly, on the surface of it. But there were people involved who were not the sort of people one deals with through solicitors' letters." She stopped. "I shouldn't say more, not without thinking about it." "I'll need you to think quickly," Hamish said, "and to stay in the village while you do." He looked at Morag. She had released her hands. She was looking at Mrs. Kerr with an expression he had not seen on her face before, or rather a combination he had not seen before, the habitual control still in place, but underneath it something that might, in another person at another time, have been the beginning of relief, and something else alongside it that was unmistakably and profoundly close to dread. Not the dread of discovery, the dread of consequence, of events set in motion by a recognition in a Highland village on a Tuesday afternoon, rolling now in a direction that could not be stopped. Outside, the loch went on glittering in its unseasonable brightness, indifferent and ancient and beautiful, entirely untroubled by the small human difficulties occurring on its shore. Chapter 6. Fear Without Greed. Hamish had a habit, when a case was turning complicated, of going for long walks along the loch shore. This was not, as Blair had once suggested with characteristic unpleasantness, because he had nothing better to do, but because Hamish had discovered long ago that his mind worked best when his feet were occupied with something simple, and his eyes had a long view to rest upon. The mountains and the water did not offer opinions or demand conclusions. They simply were, with the magnificent indifference of things that have been old since before human beings began worrying about anything at all. He walked on Wednesday morning in the thin, bright cold of a November that had not yet decided whether to turn properly cruel, with Luggs moving at his side in the unhurried way the dog had when he sensed that this was thinking walking rather than purposeful walking, and that stops would be permitted. The forensic team from Strathbane had gone, leaving behind their tape and their peculiar absence where a man had lain. Blair had departed the previous evening with a set of statements, a provisional theory that involved a wandering drunk in a poorly lit churchyard, and an instruction to Hamish not to do anything without calling it in first. Jimmy Anderson had lingered over the departure, with the air of a man who would rather have stayed, but understood that staying was not available to him. The dead man's identity, as Jimmy had quietly informed Hamish before leaving, remained formally unconfirmed. The name Alistair Grant produced a genuine person in Inverness, a retired schoolteacher of 61 with no criminal record and a complete lack of awareness that anyone had borrowed his name. And the hire car had been paid for with a credit card that traced to a shell company registered in Aberdeen and largely devoid of useful information. Blair was calling it assumed identity and treating it as a complication rather than a clue, which was precisely the wrong way round. But this was so characteristic of Blair's methodology that Hamish had stopped finding it exasperating and had arrived instead at a kind of resigned acceptance, the way one accepts the weather. He turned all of this over as he walked, but what he kept returning to was not the dead man, but the living woman. Hamish was, by nature and long practice, a close observer of economic behaviour. Not in any theoretical sense. He had no interest in theory and a mild distrust of people who led with it, but in the plain practical sense that money and its movements told you things about people that they would never tell you themselves. In his experience, a person who had committed fraud, or who was maintaining a deception for material gain, left traces in the way they lived. A certain carefulness about expenditure combined with pockets of excess, small inconsistencies between the story told and the life shown, things that did not quite add up when you put the arithmetic together. Morag Sinclair's arithmetic added up with unremarkable precision. She paid her rent on time, as the owner of the building, one Donald Fraser of Inverness, had confirmed with some bemusement when Hamish rang him. She ordered her stock from a Scottish craft cooperative and a small soap manufacturer outside Ullapool, both of whom described her as a reliable and undemanding customer. Her bank account, about which Hamish had made discreet inquiries through channels that Blair would have considered irregular and Hamish considered pragmatic, showed the tidy incomings and outgoings of a woman running a modest business without supplementary income from any source that might raise questions. She had not, in 14 months in Lochdu, borrowed money from anyone. She had not overcharged. She had not cultivated relationships with wealthier villagers in ways that might lead to gifts or bequests. She had not sought the kind of social position that some newcomers pursued with embarrassing transparency, inserting themselves into committees and fundraising drives as a path to influence. She had joined the Kirk's baking rota and the annual Lochshaw litter pick, and had otherwise remained pleasantly on the periphery of village governance, which was exactly where the village was most comfortable with newcomers for at least the first several years. There was, in short, not a penny of visible profit in her deception. Whatever she had taken on the name and history of a dead woman to achieve, it was not money, and it was not power, and it was not the particular Highland variety of social advancement that involved being asked to open the autumn fair. "She's hiding," Hamish told Luggs, who had paused to examine something half buried in the shingle at the loch's edge. "Aye, she's hiding, but not for profit." Luggs extracted from the shingle what appeared to be a very old and thoroughly deceased crab, regarded it with detached interest, and left it where he had found it, which Hamish felt was the appropriate response. The question of what she was hiding from had become considerably more pressing since Tuesday afternoon, and Mrs. Kerr's account of a complicated financial matter, and people who were not the sort one dealt with through solicitors' letters. This was the careful phrasing of a woman trained to precision, and Hamish had turned it over enough times to be fairly certain of what it was describing without being told in plain language. There were criminal enterprises in Scotland that dressed themselves in the respectable clothing of financial services, property development, import and export, and that employed, alongside their accountants and their lawyers and their patient, document-heavy facades, a secondary category of staff whose services, when required, were of a nature that left no paper trail at all. A witness to such an enterprise who chose to disappear rather than trust her safety to official channels was not, in Hamish's estimation, being irrational. She was being extremely sensible, in the bleak and frightening way of someone who has made a clear-eyed assessment of her options and found them all wanting except the one that involved vanishing entirely. He had reached this conclusion more or less satisfactorily when he arrived, on his return along the shore road, at the Lochdoub Hotel, where he found Mrs. Elspeth Kerr sitting in the small residence lounge, by the window overlooking the water, with an untouched cup of tea on the table beside her, and the expression of a woman who has spent the night revising her assessment of her own situation. She looked up when he came in and said, without preamble, "I think I may have made things worse." Hamish sat down across from her. "Tell me." "I have been thinking about who might have known she was here," Mrs. Kerr said. "If I found her by accident, just by passing through, and I did, I had no idea. The village was recommended by a friend, and I wanted to see the loch." She paused. "Then someone with more purpose and more resources than a retired secretary on a leisure tour might have found her rather more directly." "Aye," said Hamish. "The man in the churchyard." She looked at him steadily. "Is it connected?" "I think it very likely," Hamish said. Mrs. Kerr absorbed this. Outside, the loch carried a single fishing boat on its glittering surface, tiny with distance, its engine a faint thread of sound against the wind. She was a witness, Mrs. Kerr said, to something she was not meant to see, and was not meant to survive seeing, I always thought, though I could never say so in any professional capacity. She looked down at her untouched tea. I used to wonder afterward whether she was still alive. It is strange, is it not, to wonder that about someone and have no way to know? "Did you tell anyone?" Hamish asked. "That you had recognised her, before you spoke to her?" The pause was brief, but sufficient. "I rang my daughter," Mrs. Kerr said, "last night, just to say I had had a surprise. I gave no details." "Did you use your mobile?" She understood the implication immediately, because she was a precise and intelligent woman, and Hamish watched the colour leave her face in the gradual way of someone grasping not a single terrible fact, but the shape of a terrible situation. "Yes," she said, "I did." Hamish said nothing for a moment, looking out at the loch and the distant boat and the mountains beyond, white-capped now against the hard blue of the November sky. "Finish your tea," he said at last, in a tone that was gentle enough to be kind and firm enough to mean rather more than tea. "And then I would like you to move to a different room, one at the back of the building, away from the road." He left her there and walked back to the station with lugs at his heels, and the pleasantly brittle quality of the morning had gone out of the day entirely. Chapter 7. A Life in Hiding. There are conversations that a police constable cannot have in any official capacity, and must therefore have in a kitchen, over tea, at a time that does not appear in any duty log, and which will never feature in any statement submitted to Strathbane. Hamish Macbeth had conducted a number of such conversations over the years, and had found them, on balance, more productive than the official kind, largely because the kitchen table removed the element of confrontation, and the tea gave people's hands something to do while their mouths worked out what their minds had already decided. He knocked on the back door of Heather and Stone at 6:30 on Wednesday evening, after the shop had been closed and locked, and the main street had settled into its post-supper quiet. Morag let him in without apparent surprise. She had, he noticed, been doing accounts at the small table in the back room, with a mug of something warm at her elbow and a pencil tucked behind her ear, and the ordinariness of the scene was its own kind of statement. She put the kettle on without being asked. Hamish sat at the table and looked at the account books open before him, columns of small, careful figures, and waited while she made tea with the unhurried efficiency she brought to most things. She set his mug down and sat across from him and looked at him directly, and he understood from the quality of the silence that she had also been thinking, and that she had spent the day reaching a decision, and that the decision had not been arrived at without cost. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Enough," Hamish said. "I'd rather hear it from you." She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the surface of her tea for a long moment. Then she said, without drama, in the tone of someone reading a document they have read so many times, it has lost the power to upset them. "My name is Fiona Aldridge. I was born in Perth in 1980. I worked for several years as an accounts administrator for a property management company in Inverness called Caledonian Crown Holdings." Hamish nodded and said nothing. "The company was legitimate on the surface," Fiona continued. "Commercial property, residential development, some foreign investment, respectable clients, a presentable office, Christmas parties with a proper caterer. I was there for 4 years before I understood what the legitimate business was being used to cover." She paused. "Money, large amounts of it, moving through the property accounts in ways that were designed not to be noticed. I noticed." Another pause, shorter. "I noticed because I was good at my job, and being good at my job turned out to be extremely inconvenient." "What did you do?" Hamish asked. I made the mistake of asking questions internally, she said, with a flatness that carried a great weight of retrospective regret. I thought it was an error. I thought perhaps I'd misunderstood. I went to my line manager, a man called Rowan Guthrie, and I showed him the discrepancies I had found, and the expression on his face when I laid the papers in front of him told me everything I needed to know, which was that there was no error and that I had just announced myself to the wrong people. She lifted her mug and set it down again without drinking. I left that afternoon, she said. I had enough sense for that at least. I went to a solicitor, not one connected to them, I hoped, though at the time I was not certain of anything, and I provided an account of what I'd seen and left copies of the relevant documents. That was the visit that Mrs. Kerr witnessed. She was the secretary who showed me in. Fiona looked toward the window, where the last grey light of the November evening lay flat against the glass. What I did not do was go to the police. Why not? Because Rowan Guthrie had 3 years earlier been a detective inspector in Inverness, she said, and because 2 of the names on the property transfer documents I had photographed were names I recognised from a court case I'd followed. Names of people who'd been charged and then, through a sequence of events that the newspapers described as procedural, had the charges dropped. I did not know how many people they had access to or at what level. I only knew that I was a woman alone with a set of document photographs on her phone, and that the correct official channels felt very much like a door opening onto nothing. The kitchen was quiet around them. From somewhere outside came the sound of water moving in the harbour, and the distant low note of a vessel navigating the loch in the dark. "So you disappeared," Hamish said. "I found a name," she said. "Morag Sinclair. I found her in an old registration record, a woman who had died 3 years before. No family, no one looking for her. I was careful. I took nothing from her that had value to anyone. I built a new history from the edges inward." She looked at Hamish steadily. "I was not proud of it, but I was alive to feel that. The man in the churchyard," Hamish said. "The man calling himself Alistair Grant. He found me about 8 months ago," she said. "I first saw him in Ullapool. I thought it was coincidence. Then he appeared at a craft fair in Dingwall. I moved up my timeline for leaving wherever I was and came here sooner than I had planned." She set down her mug. "When he walked into the shop last week, I knew the coincidences were over." "Did he threaten you?" "Not explicitly. He was careful. He spoke about how beautiful the village was, how peaceful it must be to live somewhere so remote. He said that it was the kind of place where a person could feel very safe." Her voice was precise and entirely controlled. "He told me that he had friends who sometimes came north for the scenery." He left it at that. Hamish turned his mug slowly in his hands. So the dead man had been a scout. He had come to confirm her location and deliver a message and had died before reporting back, which meant that his death, far from solving a problem, had created a different and more urgent one. "Someone sent him," Hamish said, "and someone will have expected to hear from him." "Yes," said Fiona. The word was quiet and very still. "Mrs. Kerr rang her daughter from her mobile yesterday evening," Hamish said. "She used no names and gave no details, but a mobile call from Lochdu, placed the day after they lost contact with their man, may be enough for someone determined to draw a line between 2 points." Fiona put her face in her hands. Not dramatically, just briefly, with the private exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and has just been informed that it is heavier than she had calculated. When she lifted her head, her expression had settled again, but it had settled differently, the way a landscape settles after rain, the same features rearranged by circumstance into something more honest. "I should have left the moment he walked into the shop," she said. "Perhaps," said Hamish, "but you're not leaving now." She looked at him. "Because if they have reason to believe you're here," he said, "leaving the village on your own is the most dangerous thing you could do. And because Lochdubh is my village, and I know every road into it and every face that doesn't belong, and I know the people who live here, and they are—" He stopped, picked up his mug and drank his tea. "They are not people who let harm come to their own without a considerable argument." The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but in the same family. Outside, the loch was dark, and the mountains were invisible against the sky, and somewhere in the village a door closed against the November cold, and the harbour light laid its steady yellow beam across the black water, patient and reliable as it had always been. Chapter 8. The Predator in the Village. The fisherman had arrived on a Saturday. This was a detail Hamish had registered and set aside at the time, the way you set aside a stone on a path because it has not yet become relevant to trip over. Saturday was not a bus day, which meant the man had come by car, but no car had been noted on the main street, which meant he had parked somewhere along the upper road and walked down to the village. He had introduced himself at the Claymore Bar as Davy Muir, from Oban, up for the fishing, and had produced in support of this claim a set of rods and a tackle bag of adequate authenticity, and a willingness to discuss flies and water temperature that had satisfied Archie MacLean, who was the village's principal authority on such matters and not easily deceived on the subject. He had taken a room at the Lochdoub Hotel, one floor below Mrs. Kerr's original room, and he had been there for 5 days before the man calling himself Alistair Grant arrived on the Wednesday. This chronology, which Hamish reconstructed on Thursday morning from conversations with Rory, and with 2 other people who had no idea they were providing anything more useful than casual chat, had the significance of a fact that has been waiting patiently to be noticed. The scout had come second, the fisherman had come first. Hamish sat at the kitchen table with this arithmetic and found it cold company. A man who arrived before the person sent to confirm the target's location was not a backup. He was a principal. He was the one who had come to do the work, and he had come early enough to establish himself, to become a familiar face, to be the sort of man who is seen and then not seen because he has made himself part of the background. Davy Muir had been in Lochdoub for 5 days, and had achieved an almost total social camouflage, which was, Hamish reflected, considerably more impressive than it sounded, given that Lochdoub was a village of fewer than 300 people, in which an unfamiliar face was, under normal circumstances, the subject of interested observation for at least a fortnight. He had done it by making himself useful. He had helped Geordie Mackay carry boxes from the post office van on the Monday morning. He had bought a round at the Claymore on Tuesday evening, and had listened more than he talked. He had complimented Mrs. Wellington on the harvest arrangement in the Kirk porch on Wednesday, and Mrs. Wellington, who received compliments on the Kirk arrangements with the gracious condescension of one who considers them only her due, had subsequently mentioned to at least 4 people that the fishing visitor seemed a perfectly decent sort of man. In a village that ran on trust, he had purchased trust efficiently, at the modest cost of a round of drinks and some timely heavy lifting. Hamish walked to the harbour on Thursday morning with lugs at his heel, and found the fisherman on the pier in the thin early light, his rods set up with professional patience, a thermos beside him on the stone, his eyes on the water. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad across the shoulders in a way that a waterproof jacket could not entirely conceal, with the kind of physical stillness that is not relaxation but control, the deliberate quietude of someone who has trained themselves to take up exactly the space required, and no more. "Morning," said Hamish, in the tone of a man who has all the time in the world and nowhere in particular to be. "Constable?" Davy Muir glanced sideways with a pleasant expression that reached no further than the surface of his face. "Early for a patrol." "I like the harbour in the morning," Hamish said honestly. He stood beside the man and looked out at the loch, which was the colour of pewter, under a sky that had not yet decided on its disposition for the day. Lugg sat between them and looked at the water with the ancient philosophical interest of a dog who has decided that lochs are worthy of extended contemplation. "Any luck?" Hamish asked, nodding at the rods. "Slow," said Muir. "But that's the thing about fishing. You wait." There was nothing in the words themselves, but Hamish heard the thing underneath them, the patience of a professional, the calm of a man who has learned that the work comes to you if you stay still long enough and maintain the correct appearance. He stayed for 10 minutes, talking about nothing in particular with the easy inconsequence that was the Highland conversational method for assessing a man without appearing to do so, and then walked back up the harbour road with lugs, and he was thinking very hard and very fast while keeping his face entirely mild. Back at the station, he rang Jimmy Anderson on Jimmy's personal mobile. "I need a check," he said. "Quiet, not through the system. A man calling himself Davy Muir from Oban, staying at the Lochdoub Hotel, arrived last Saturday. Fisherman, or presenting as one. Mid to late 30s, heavy build, brown hair, a scar on the back of the right hand, small, possibly old." "You've been looking at his hands," Jimmy said, in the tone of a man noting an observation that does not occur to casual conversationalists. "I look at a lot of things," Hamish said. "What am I looking for?" "Whether he exists," Hamish said, "and if he does, whether who he is matches what he appears to be, and whether the name Rowan Guthrie means anything in the context of Inverness financial crime, specifically a company called Caledonian Crown Holdings." A silence on the other end of the line while Jimmy absorbed this. "Hamish," he said, with the careful tone of a man navigating a gap between what he knows and what he can say. "If this is what I think it might be based on those names, you are well outside anything I can cover for you with Blair." "I know it," Hamish said. "Just the cheque for now, Jimmy, that's all." He spent the rest of the morning watching the village with the systematic attention of a man conducting an inventory. He noted every route by which the harbour could be observed from a distance. He noted the angles of visibility from the hotel's ground floor windows. He noted that Heather and Stone's rear exit opened onto a lane that ran between the back of the Main Street properties and the base of the hillside, dark at night, unlit, and reached from the upper road by a track that no one who had not been in the village a week would know to use. A week was exactly how long Davy Muir had been in the village. Jimmy called back at 2:30. "Davy Muir of Oban is a retired postman of 73, Jimmy said. "He's not been north of Loch Lomond in 4 years on account of his hip." Hamish said nothing. Caledonian Crown Holdings was the subject of a Financial Intelligence Unit review that was closed without prosecution 18 months ago, Jimmy continued. The lead investigator filed a complaint afterwards citing interference at a senior level. He was reassigned. The complaint was not upheld. A pause. "Rowan Guthrie is now the director of a property consultancy in Edinburgh. He drives a very nice car. And the man who looks like Davy Muir and is currently sitting on my harbour pier?" "Not on any database I can access in the next 5 minutes, Jimmy said, which is itself an answer of a kind. "Aye," said Hamish. "It is." He set down the phone and looked out the station window at the main street of Lochdu, where Angus MacLean was arguing with someone about a fence post, and 2 children were cycling in the direction of the school, and the sign above Heather and Stone turned in the coastal wind with its familiar creak. A man with no traceable identity arrived before the confirmed spotter, established in the community, patient as a waiting tide, and now the spotter was dead in the churchyard, and Mrs. Kerr had made a telephone call, and the man on the pier was sitting very still and watching the water with the focused calm of someone who has decided that the waiting is nearly done. Hamish stood up and put on his jacket with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has a great deal to do and intends to do it in the right order. The time for watching was over. Chapter 9. Drawing out the Killer. The difficulty with setting a trap in a small village was that the trap and the village were made of the same material. The people of Lochdu were its early warning system, its intelligence network, and its primary communication infrastructure all at once, and these functions operated with a speed and comprehensiveness that any professional organisation might have envied. The challenge was not how to use this network. The challenge was how to use it precisely, which meant giving people enough of the truth to act on without giving them so much that the information reached the wrong ears in the wrong form before Hamish was ready for it to travel at all. He began with Jimmy Anderson, who arrived on Thursday afternoon in a private car rather than a police vehicle, wearing ordinary clothes, and who told Rory at the hotel that he was visiting an old friend in the area and needed a room for the night. Rory gave him room 3, which was on the opposite side of the building from where the man calling himself Davy Muir occupied room 7, and which would have to do. Hamish met Jimmy on the shore path at dusk, away from the hotel and the harbour, in the place where the path curved behind a stand of birch trees that stood between the loch and the lower end of the village. The water was black and perfectly still. The mountains were shapes against a sky that had gone the deep charcoal of a Highland evening, and the first lights of the village reflected long and unsteady in the loch's surface below them. "You're not going to tell Blair," Jimmy said. It was not a question. "Blair will want to move him before we're ready," Hamish said. "And if he moves him too early and the charge doesn't hold, or if there's someone in Strathbane who makes a call to Edinburgh, that man walks, and Fiona does not see the spring." Jimmy was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the birch trees with a dry, whispering insistence. "What do you need?" he asked. Hamish told him. The first element of the arrangement was Fiona herself, who received Hamish's proposal across her kitchen table that evening with the stillness of a woman who has learned to assess risk quickly and without the luxury of hesitation. He explained what he intended. He did not minimize the danger or dress it in reassurance it did not deserve. He told her plainly that the man in room 7 would move when he believed she was moving, and that Hamish intended to be between them when he did, and that there was a version of this that went exactly as planned, and another version in which it did not, and that he required her cooperation for either version to have a reasonable chance. She listened without interrupting, which was itself a quality he had come to respect in her. "Where would you have me go?" she asked when he had finished. "Not far," he said. "Mrs. Wellington has a spare room. She doesn't know the particulars and she won't ask because I've told her it's a police matter, and Mrs. Wellington's instinct when it comes to police matters is to comply first and interrogate afterward, which is a very useful quality in a minister's wife. The ghost of expression that crossed Fiona's face on this occasion was slightly more substantial than on previous occasions. She moved to Mrs. Wellington's house after dark, through the back lane behind the Main Street properties, carrying a single bag, with Hamish 2 steps ahead and lugs, who understood perfectly well that this was not an ordinary late walk and conducted himself accordingly, silent and close-footed on the lane's rough surface, at the rear. Mrs. Wellington received her with a thermos of cocoa and the brisk practicality of a woman who considers the sheltering of the vulnerable to be simply an extension of Christian duty, and who asks no questions that she has been requested not to ask, and who would, Hamish reflected, be a formidable person to have on your side in any difficulty. The second element was the information itself, and this required a particular touch, because false information released into Lochdoub's communication network without sufficient care was liable to emerge at the other end as something entirely unrecognisable, having passed through the interpretive processes of at least 6 people, and acquired, in transit, details and emphasis that bore only a theoretical relationship to the original. Hamish sat down with Donny Mackenzie on Thursday evening, and told him, in a tone of mild confidentiality, that he knew Donny could not resist relaying, that he had heard the woman from the craft shop was thinking of leaving the village, something about family circumstances down south. She might be going in the morning, early, before the shop opened. It was a shame. She'd settled in so well. He said all of this with the wistful, gossipy air of a man sharing a small piece of community news, and Donny received it with the transparent delight of someone handed a task perfectly suited to his natural gifts. By 9 o'clock that evening the information had travelled in various forms and with varying degrees of embellishment to at least 15 households. By 9:30 it had reached the Claymore Bar, which was the terminal node of the village's information system, and from there it had presumably entered the consciousness of the man nursing his evening whisky at the end of the bar, with his back to the wall and his eyes on the room. The man who was not Davy Muir from Oban. Hamish spent the remainder of Thursday evening making arrangements that he described to no one in their entirety. He spoke to 4 men in the village separately, each of whom received a specific and partial instruction, and who were chosen for their discretion, their knowledge of the local geography, and their shared characteristic of being the sort of people who do not require explanations in order to act on a request from Hamish Macbeth. Alistair Ross, whose farm sat on the upper road and who had eyes that the darkness did not much inconvenience. Willie Mackenzie, who knew the back lane behind the main street better than anyone alive, having spent a portion of his youth using it for purposes that need not detain the record. Donny himself, redirected to a specific and limited function, now that his primary usefulness had been served, and a 4th man whose involvement Hamish would not have predicted a week ago, the Reverend Mr. Wellington, who received his instructions with the expression of a man discovering, not unpleasantly, that the ministry could encompass applications he had not previously considered. By 11 o'clock, Lochdoub was dark and quiet in the way that it was never entirely dark and quiet, the way of a community that sleeps but does not stop attending, where lights go off in sequence and curtains move and the village keeps its own counsel in the particular, ancient manner of places that have learned to look after themselves. Hamish took up his position in the deep shadow of the old yew tree beside the kirkyard wall at 20 minutes past 11, with lugs settled at his feet and the cold entering his boots with a slow, Highland thoroughness that was not improved by standing still. The loch was a dark mirror below. The mountains were masses of deeper darkness against the sky. The village breathed around him in its night rhythms, a door, a light, the distant note of Archie MacLean's television carrying thinly through the cold air. At 11:30, Jimmy Anderson confirmed by a brief silent signal from across the kirkyard lane that room 7 was empty. Hamish had expected this. A man of that patience and that precision would not rush. He would wait until the village was properly dark, until the last lights were off and the last late walker had gone in. He would then move along the back lane toward Mrs. Wellington's house, toward a woman he believed to be preparing a pre-dawn departure, alone and unprotected, in a village that trusted her enough to leave her to it. The church bell above Hamish's head was silent in the dark. No one rang it this time. The night held its breath, and Hamish held his, and somewhere in the lane behind him, he heard the soft, deliberate sound of a footstep that was trying very hard not to be heard at all. Chapter 10. The Bell and the Silence After. The footsteps stopped. Hamish stood motionless in the shadow of the yew tree, his back against the old cold stone of the kirkyard wall, and listened to the night with the concentrated attention of a man who has learned to read silence the way other people read print. Lugs had gone rigid at his feet, not a muscle moving, the dog's considerable instincts aligned with his master's in the manner of a creature who understands that the next few minutes are not the occasion for enthusiasm. 30 seconds passed. Then the footsteps resumed, quieter now, more deliberate, moving along the back lane toward the point where it narrowed beside the rear of the Wellington house, where a light burned in the upstairs window, arranged by Hamish earlier in the evening, a lamp on a timer, a convincing enough intimation of a woman awake and preparing to leave before dawn. Hamish came away from the wall and moved along the outside of the kirkyard, keeping to the verge where the grass muffled his boots, and Lugg stayed close without being commanded to, which was one of the dog's more endearing qualities, in circumstances where the giving of commands would have been extremely inconvenient. He came around the corner of the lane in time to see the shape of the man. Dark clothing, hood up, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who has assessed the terrain and found it satisfactory. Reached the gate at the back of the Wellington garden and stopped there, looking up at the lit window with the focused attention of a craftsman taking a final measurement before he begins. "That'll do," said Hamish. His voice in the cold air was not loud. It did not need to be. The lane was perhaps 8 feet wide, and he was 4 feet behind the man, and Jimmy Anderson was at the far end of the lane, and Alistair Ross was on the upper road above them, and Willie Mackenzie was somewhere in the darkness to the left, with the patient stillness of a man who has spent a lifetime in and around places where stillness is useful. The man did not turn immediately. This was itself a form of information. A startled person turns. A professional takes a moment to process what has happened and recalculate. When he turned, his face was in shadow under the hood, but Hamish could see the set of the shoulders and the quality of the stillness, and neither of these things was the stillness of someone who has decided to comply. "Constable Macbeth," the man said. His voice was flat and uninflected, the voice of someone who considers conversation a medium of very limited usefulness. "You've been busy." "It's a small village," Hamish said. "Busyness is relative." "The woman isn't here." "No," Hamish agreed. "She isn't." A silence. The lamp glowed in the Wellington window above them, warm and domestic and entirely fraudulent. Somewhere on the loch a bird called once, and was answered by nothing. "You've been following her for 8 months," Hamish said. It was not a question. Ullapool, then Dingwall, then here. The man in the churchyard was yours, sent ahead to confirm the location and deliver a message. When he stopped reporting in, you knew the situation had changed. Mrs. Kerr's phone call from the hotel put the last piece in place. The man said nothing. "You killed him," Hamish said. "Your own colleague, because he'd been seen by Mrs. Kerr and spoken to Fiona, and because a man who's been made, who's been connected to the target, is a man who can be traced back. You couldn't afford the thread." Still nothing. But something had shifted in the man's posture, a fractional change in weight distribution that Hamish recognised as preliminary to movement. "People like her," the man said at last, "don't get new lives. It doesn't work that way. You cover for her tonight, you think that's the end of it. It isn't. There are people I report to who are not going to accept a constable in the Highlands as an obstacle." "No," said Hamish thoughtfully, "I don't imagine they will. That's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight's problem is more straightforward." The man moved. It was fast and it was committed, and it was the movement of someone who has done this before, and carries no particular sentiment about the doing of it. He came low and hard, and Hamish stepped to the right rather than back, which was not what the man had calculated on, and the momentum that had been directed at the centre of Hamish's chest met instead the leverage of Hamish's left arm, catching his right shoulder and redirecting it sideways into the lane wall with a force that was amplified considerably by the wall's participation. The man hit the stone with a sound that was both brief and comprehensive. He did not stay down. Hamish had not expected him to. He came back up with a speed that confirmed every assessment Hamish had made about him, and there was something in his right hand now that caught the faint reflected light from the Wellington window, and Hamish caught the wrist that held it, and held it against the wall with his full weight behind the grip, and they stood pressed against the cold stone of the lane for a period of time that felt considerably longer than it was, each of them entirely focused on the geometry of force and counterforce, until Jimmy Anderson arrived from the far end of the lane at something approaching a run, and the geometry changed decisively. The knife, a short, practical thing with the impersonal quality of a tool rather than a weapon, fell onto the cobbles. The man went still. "Daniel Kerr, you're under arrest," Jimmy said, adding the caution in the swift, practiced tone of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity and intends to do it correctly, and then looking at Hamish over the man's bowed head with an expression that managed to convey relief, exasperation, and professional admiration in approximately equal measure. "Kerr," Hamish said. He looked at Jimmy. "Not related to Mrs. Kerr," Jimmy said quietly. "I checked on the way up. Common enough name." Hamish nodded and looked down at the knife on the cobbles, and then up at the lamp in the Wellington window, and then out past the end of the lane at the dark water of the loch, and he breathed the cold November air with the deliberate gratitude of a man who has just spent 30 seconds uncertain whether he was going to be able to continue doing so. Luggs pressed his head against Hamish's knee, and was scratched behind the ears in the absent-minded manner of a man whose thoughts are already moving on to what comes next. What came next was complicated and slow, and not entirely satisfying, as the aftermath of such things generally is. There were calls to Strathbane at an hour that did nothing to improve Blair's disposition, and a great deal of procedural activity, and the formal arrest, and the statements, and the careful management of what the village was told and what it was not. The man who had called himself Davy Muir gave his real name, in the end, to officers from a unit in Edinburgh that Blair had not been aware was involved, and the involvement of that unit and the speed of its arrival told Hamish something useful about the seriousness of what lay behind Caledonian Crown holdings, and confirmed that his decision not to put any of it through Strathbane had been on balance the right one. The official version of events as recorded was not entirely false. It described the arrest of a man in connection with the death of another man in a churchyard, both of whom had been in the village under false identities, and it attributed the matter to a dispute whose origins lay in Inverness, and whose resolution had been effected by the timely intervention of the local constable. It said nothing about a woman named Fiona Aldridge. It said nothing about Caledonian Crown Holdings or Rowan Guthrie, or a financial intelligence unit review that had been closed without prosecution 18 months ago. Loch Dubh itself said a great deal more than the official version over the following days, in the way that Loch Dubh always did. But what it said remained within the village, in the manner of things that a community decides, collectively and without discussion, are its own business. Morag Sinclair opened Heather and Stone on the Monday morning following as though nothing had happened, and her window display had been changed to include some new hand-thrown pottery and a set of woven table mats in the muted greens and greys of the Highland winter, and several people went in on that Monday to buy things they did not strictly need, which was Loch Dubh's characteristic way of saying what it did not otherwise put into words. Mrs. Wellington told Mrs. Mackenzie that the whole business had been very disturbing, and that she was glad it was resolved, and that Morag Sinclair had been an absolute rock throughout, which was as close as Mrs. Wellington was ever likely to come to a declaration of unconditional acceptance. Hamish walked the loch shore that Monday evening with Luggs at his heel, and Sonsie appearing periodically from the undergrowth, and then vanishing again with the selective sociability that was her defining trait. And he thought about justice and its varieties and its limitations, and about the difference between the law and what the law was made to protect, and about a woman who had chosen a Highland village as the place where she might finally stop running, and about whether that choice made out of fear and exhaustion and the ancient human need to belong somewhere entitled her to the thing she had found. He thought that it probably did. Everyone deserved a place to begin again, so long as they had not brought harm with them. She had not brought harm. Harm had followed her, uninvited, and had been dealt with in the lane behind the main street on a November night, with a knife on the cobbles and a lamp burning in a window and the mountains standing dark above the village as they had always stood, impervious and enduring and thoroughly indifferent to human difficulty. As he turned for home, the church bell rang. Once, clean and clear across the water, rolling away into the mountains until the silence took it, and then, this time, nothing more. Hamish Macbeth walked back through the dark village with his dog at his heel, and the cold off the loch against his face, and he was, on the whole, content.